Welcome, dear readers, to a story that transcends time. Today I bring you a narrative that transports us to Mexico in 1882, where the mountains guard secrets and wounded hearts find healing. This is the story of a nameless woman who arrived in Tierra Blanca seeking not just refuge, but a new identity, and of a solitary man who learned that love can flourish even in the most arid terrain of the soul. From where do you accompany us today? I would love to know in what corner of the world you find yourselves while listening to this story that speaks of resistance, hope, and the transformative power of true love. If this story touches your hearts, as I hope it will, don't forget to subscribe and leave your like. Each gesture from you helps me continue sharing these narratives that celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Year 1882. Location: Tierra Blanca railroad station in the mountains of northern Mexico. The train whistle faded among the mountains, like a lament that carried away the last hopes of those who heard it depart. On the platform of Tierra Blanca, where the wind dragged reddish dust and forgotten memories, a solitary figure watched the iron rails until they disappeared on the horizon. The woman who had descended from the third-class car had no name, at least none she wanted to remember. Her navy blue dress, torn at the hem, told stories that her lips refused to pronounce. In her right hand, she held a worn fabric bag mended with golden thread that formed an imperfect but persistent flower, like a smile drawn over a wound. The scratch on her left temple had begun to heal, forming a pink line that extended from her hairline to the corner of her eye. It was a mark that spoke of resistance, of a fight she had decided to win by fleeing rather than submitting. Tierra Blanca was not a destination. It was an accidental refuge chosen by desperation when the conductor announced that the train would stop there for repairs. The station consisted of an adobe building with red tiles that peeled off like dried tears, surrounded by a few constructions that clung to life with the same tenacity as cacti to rocky slopes. The San Jose boarding house was the first door that closed before her. The fat woman who attended the counter looked her up and down, lingering on the stains on her skirt and the absence of respectable luggage. "We have no available rooms," she lied without bothering to consult the registry book. The El Coyote Cantina was no kinder. The men drinking mezcal inside observed her with eyes that promised trouble, and the bartender made a disdainful gesture with his head before she could even approach the counter. The general store, the blacksmith shop, even the small chapel, each door closed with the same definitive sound, as if the entire town had conspired to deny her existence. The sun began to descend behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and purple colors that contrasted cruelly with the growing darkness settling in the woman's heart. She found refuge in an abandoned shed behind the station, where rusty tools and empty burlap sacks offered her the only hospitality she had received in Tierra Blanca. She curled up in a corner, embracing her bag as if it were a child, and closed her eyes to avoid seeing the reality that surrounded her. But the peace lasted little. Male voices approached when the moon had already taken possession of the sky. 3 men appeared at the threshold of the shed, their silhouettes outlined against the silver light like nightmare shadows. "Look what we found here," said the tallest with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A stranger with no place to sleep." She sat up slowly, maintaining dignity like an invisible shield. She didn't speak, but her gaze told them everything they needed to know. She would not surrender without a fight. "We can help her," continued another, taking a step closer. "We know places, safe places." The word safe left his lips like a threat wrapped in velvet. The woman backed away until her back touched the wooden wall of the shed. Her hand found a rusty hammer among the abandoned tools. Then a deep voice cut through the night like a sword. "The lady already has lodging." A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a tall man with broad shoulders and deliberate movements. His wide-brimmed hat partially concealed his face, but the natural authority in his posture was unmistakable. The 3 intruders turned momentarily disconcerted. "Francisco Herrera," murmured one of them, and the name sounded like an apology. "We didn't know that." "Now you know," responded the man without raising his voice. "You may withdraw." There was no discussion. The 3 men vanished into the night as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of their hurried steps. Francisco Herrera approached slowly, like one approaching a wounded animal. He stopped at a respectful distance and removed, his hat revealing a face weathered by the sun and marked by an ancient sadness. "They won't return," he said simply. "You can sleep peacefully." Without more words, he withdrew into the night, but when the woman awoke at dawn, she found beside her a soft wool blanket and a cup of still steaming coffee. The aroma of cinnamon and brown sugar mixed with the fresh morning air, and for the first time since she had fled, she felt something resembling hope. Who was this man who protected strangers without asking anything in return, and why did his eyes seem to reflect the same pain she carried, engraved in her soul? The days in Tierra Blanca succeeded each other with the monotony of the wind that swept the dusty streets. The nameless woman had converted the abandoned shed into her temporary home, organizing the rusty tools as if they were precious furniture and using the burlap sacks as improvised curtains to create the illusion of privacy. Each morning she repeated the same ritual of humiliation. She traversed the town's establishments, offering her work in exchange for food or a place to sleep. She knew how to sew, cook, clean. She had the skilled hands of one who had learned since childhood that her value was measured in services rendered. But in Tierra Blanca, her unknown origin marked her as a threat, a stain on the established order of their lives. On the third day, while returning to the shed with empty hands and a rumbling stomach, she saw him again. Francisco Herrera was by, the main well filling buckets with water. When their gazes met, he didn't look away as the others did. Instead, he approached with measured steps like one who doesn't want to frighten a butterfly perched on a flower. "You're hungry." It wasn't a question but an observation pronounced with the simplicity of one stating an evident truth. From his leather satchel, he extracted a piece of bread wrapped in clean cloth. He extended it without ceremony, without questions about her past or explanations about her present. She accepted it because dignity, she had learned, sometimes requires knowing when to surrender. The bread was warm and tasted of home, of those childhood moments when the world still made sense and kitchens smelled of safety. She ate it in small pieces, making it last as long as possible, while Francisco withdrew without waiting for thanks. That afternoon the clouds congregated over the mountains like a grey army preparing for battle. The storm arrived with the characteristic violence of those heights, transforming the dry air into a curtain of water that struck the thirsty earth with liberating fury. In the shed, the woman huddled under the blanket that Francisco had left, listening to the incessant drumming of rain on the metal roof. Water filtered through the cracks, forming puddles that reflected the lightning like broken mirrors. The cold pierced her to the bone, and her teeth chattered with a rhythm that competed with that of the storm. It was then that he appeared again, emerging from the curtain of water like an apparition. Francisco wore a wool poncho that partially protected him from the rain, but his hat dripped like a poorly constructed cornice. "You can't stay here," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "The shed floods when it rains like this." She didn't respond, but she also didn't move. Where could she go? What was the difference between drowning in the shed or in the weather? Francisco seemed to read her thoughts. He approached and, without touching her, gestured toward the door. "My house is on the hill," he said. "There you'll be dry." The path to Francisco Herrera's house wound along trails that had become improvised streams. They walked in silence, she following his sure steps, while mud adhered to her worn boots like desperate hands trying to stop her. The house appeared among the pine trees like a well-kept secret. It was a simple construction of stone and wood, with a tile roof that resisted the storm's assault with silent dignity. A warm light shone in the windows, promising the refuge she had been seeking without knowing it. The interior was Spartan, but welcoming. A rustic wooden table occupied the center of the main room, surrounded by chairs that seemed to await conversations that never came. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and beside it a solitary rocking chair swayed slightly with the air currents. Francisco lit the fire with precise movements, feeding the flames until the room filled with warmth and golden light. The aroma of burning wood mixed with the smell of rain they brought on their clothes, creating an olfactory symphony that spoke of refuge and second chances. "You can sleep in the room," he said, signaling a closed door. "There are dry clothes in the wardrobe." She looked at him without understanding. Did he expect something in return? Was this another trap disguised as kindness? Her experience had taught her that male generosity always had a price. Francisco seemed to read her distrust in the tension of her shoulders, in the way she maintained distance, and kept the fabric bag pressed to her chest like a shield. "I expect nothing," he said with a soft voice. "Only that you sleep dry and safe." He withdrew to the kitchen, leaving her alone before the fire. In the room he had offered her, she found a single bed with clean sheets that smelled of lavender, and a wool blanket woven in blue and white tones. In the wardrobe hung a simple cotton dress too large for her, but infinitely more dignified than her soaked clothes. That night, while the storm gradually calmed until it became a gentle rain that lulled sleep, the nameless woman slept in a real bed for the first time since her flight. And in her dreams, instead of the nightmares that pursued her each night, she saw a garden where flowers grew that had no name, but emanated a fragrance of hope. In the adjoining room, Francisco Herrera remained awake, listening to the peaceful breathing of his temporary guest, and wondering why fate had brought to his door someone who seemed to need exactly the same thing he did, a reason to continue believing in the goodness of the world. Morning arrived, dressed in silver mist that rose from the damp earth like silent prayers. The woman awakened in a bed that wasn't hers in a house she didn't know, but for the first time in weeks without the start of fear running through her veins. The light filtered through cotton curtains, painted soft shapes on the wooden walls, and the silence had a different quality. It wasn't the tense silence of one hiding, but the peaceful quiet of one who could finally breathe. She dressed in the sash, cotton dress that Francisco had left for her. It hung loose, but the fabric was soft against her skin and smelled of chamomile soap. When she left the room, she found him in the kitchen preparing coffee in a clay pot over a wood stove. The aroma filled the space like an invisible embrace. "Good morning," he said without turning, as if he had sensed her presence. "Did you sleep?" "Well," she nodded, though he couldn't see her. Words continued to be difficult, as if she had forgotten how to form sounds that weren't screams or pleas. Francisco served her coffee in a blue ceramic cup, adding a little goat's milk and brown sugar. The first sip was a revelation, sweet, warm, comforting. It had been so long since she had tasted something prepared with care, with the intention of giving pleasure, rather than simply subsisting. They had breakfast in a silence that didn't need to be filled with words. He had prepared scrambled eggs with herbs from his garden and tortillas that still retained the warmth of the griddle. She ate slowly, savoring each piece as if it were the last or the first of many to come. After breakfast, Francisco prepared to leave. He put on a clean white cotton shirt and a wool vest, transforming from the solitary farmer into the man who visited the town on Thursdays. "I'm going to Tierra Blanca," he explained. "You can come if you want or stay here. The house is yours as long as you need it." The decision to accompany him wasn't rational. Tierra Blanca represented rejection, closed doors, and disdainful looks. But something in the way Francisco had said, "As long as you need it, not as long as I allow it," made her feel that perhaps with him by her side, she could walk those streets without feeling invisible. The path to the town wound among pines and oaks, and Francisco knew every stone, every curve, every place where the trail divided. He walked with the naturalness of one who belonged to that land, but without the arrogance of one who believed himself its owner. Occasionally he pointed something out, an eagle's nest in the heights, a natural spring where crystal-clear water bubbled, the ruins of a cabin that had belonged to his grandfather. "I've lived here all my life," he said while they stopped at a viewpoint overlooking the valley. "My wife Rosa, too. We raised our daughter Isabel in these mountains among these trees." It was the first time he mentioned his family, and he did, so with the naturalness of one sharing a cherished memory, not with the weight of one carrying unbearable pain. The use of the past tense didn't go unnoticed by the woman. "We raised or had belonged," words that spoke of losses that no longer bled, but left permanent scars. "Where are they now?" she dared to ask, and her voice sounded strange after so many days of silence. Francisco pointed to a hill covered with wildflowers that rose north of Tierra Blanca. "There they rest," he said. "Each week I bring them fresh flowers and tell them what has happened in the valley." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a serene sadness that spoke of someone who had learned to live with absence without allowing it to consume him. In Tierra Blanca, Francisco's presence transformed the woman's experience. The merchants, who had previously ignored her, now greeted her with courteous respect. It wasn't genuine affection, it was recognition that she had found a respected protector in the community. At the general store, Francisco bought provisions, flour, beans, coffee candles. He also bought fabric, a cream-colored cotton and another navy blue, and sewing needles. When she looked at him with curiosity, he shrugged. "I thought you might like to make new clothes," he said. "The ones you have are very worn." It was such an unexpected gesture of consideration that she felt her eyes fill with tears. It had been so long since anyone had paid attention to her practical needs, since anyone had considered her comfort or dignity. On the way home, they stopped at the hill where Rosa and Isabel rested. The graves were simple but well tended with carved wooden crosses and fresh flowers that Francisco had placed on his previous visit. The woman stayed a step behind while he knelt and spoke in a low voice, like one conversing with old friends. "Rosa Isabel," he murmured. "We have a guest. She's a brave woman who came from far away looking for a safe place. I hope you don't mind that she shares our table for a while." After a few minutes of silence, he stood and turned to her. "Would you like to say something to them?" The question caught her by surprise. She didn't know what to say to the dead of a stranger to women she hadn't known, but who had clearly loved the man who now protected her. Finally, she approached the graves and whispered, "Thank you for teaching him to be so good." Francisco smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and for a moment his face lit up with echoes of the happiness he had known. That night, while sewing by candlelight, using the fabric Francisco had bought to make a new dress, the nameless woman felt something she had forgotten existed, the sensation of belonging somewhere. It wasn't just physical refuge that Francisco had offered her, but something more precious, the opportunity to be seen as a complete person, not as a victim or a threat. In the pocket of her old dress, her fingers found the only personal object she had kept in her flight, a silk ribbon embroidered with golden threads that formed the letter C. It was all that remained of who she had been before, the only link to an identity she still didn't know if she wanted to recover or bury forever. But that night, for the first time in weeks, she slept without nightmares. And in her dreams, Rosa and Isabel smiled at her from a garden where flowers of all colors grew, including some that had no name but smelled of new beginnings. The weeks flowed like the stream that descended from the mountains, constant, tranquil polishing rough stones, until they became smooth pebbles. The nameless woman had found a rhythm in Francisco Herrera's house, a silent dance of shared tasks and respected spaces that spoke of a harmony deeper than words. Each morning, she awakened before dawn when the air still retained the coolness of night, and the crickets hadn't yet yielded their chorus to the birds. She prepared coffee while Francisco fed the goats and checked the tools. He had never asked her to take charge of domestic tasks, but she had begun doing so naturally, as a silent way of contributing to the economy of care that had been established between them. Francisco worked in the small garden he had planted behind the house, cultivating vegetables and herbs that grew with the stubbornness of things, that know how to find life even in difficult soil. She watched him from the kitchen window while washing dishes, admiring the patience with which he treated each plant as if they were creatures that deserved individual respect. One morning he brought her a notebook with yellowed pages and a pen with ink. "I thought you might like to write," he said, placing it on the table with the same naturalness with which he served coffee. "Your story, your thoughts, whatever you want to remember, or whatever you prefer to forget." She took the notebook in her hands as if it were a sacred object. The pages were blank, waiting to be filled with the words she had kept imprisoned in her throat for so long. The leather cover was worn but dignified, like everything Francisco possessed. "I don't know if I remember how to write," she murmured, and her voice sounded hoarser than expected. "Words return when they're ready," he responded, "like rains." That afternoon, sitting on the porch while Francisco repaired a broken fence, she opened the notebook and wrote her first line. "I don't remember the sound of my own voice when I was happy. It was a simple sentence, but writing it made her feel as if she had freed something that had been locked in her chest, like a bird in a cage too small. Thursdays had become the day to go to Tierra Blanca. Francisco never suggested that she accompany him, but he also didn't seem surprised when she dressed in her best clothes and waited for him by the door. The town had begun to get used to seeing them together, the nameless woman who had found refuge with the widower from the hill. At the market, Soledad the vegetable vendor had begun saving the best tomatoes and freshest peppers for her. Raphael the blacksmith greeted her with a nod that bordered on respect. The changes were subtle but significant. It was as if Francisco's constant presence had legitimized her existence in the eyes of the town. One afternoon, while Francisco spoke with Raphael about repairing a horseshoe, she wandered toward the church. Father Miguel, an elderly man, with kind eyes and hands stained, with ink from his handwritten sermons, was sweeping the steps. "Good afternoon, Senora," he said to her. "How may I help you?" "Senora?" The word resonated in her ears like a bell, not girl or stranger, but Senora, a title that implied respect, dignity, recognition as a complete adult. "I just wanted to be here for a moment," she replied, "if it's not a bother." "God's house is open to all," smiled Father Miguel, "especially for those who need peace." The church interior was cool and silent, with wooden beams that extended toward the ceiling, like arms in prayer. She sat in a back pew and closed her eyes, not exactly praying, but allowing the silence to wash away the tensions she still carried in her shoulders. When Francisco found her there an hour later, he didn't ask what she had been doing. He simply sat beside her on the pew and waited, as if he understood that some moments need to be lived in silent company. The nights had become longer with autumn's arrival. After dinner, Francisco read by the fire. Agricultural books, novels he had inherited from his father, delayed newspapers he obtained in town. She sewed or wrote in her notebook, which already contained several pages of fragmentary thoughts and memories that emerged like bubbles in a lake. One night he looked up from his book and observed her writing. The candlelight created soft shadows on her face, and for the first time since he had met her, she seemed completely relaxed. "Were you a teacher?" he asked suddenly. "Your handwriting is very beautiful." She lifted her pen and looked at him, surprised by the question. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her skills, her talents, the things she had been before becoming a fugitive. "My father," she began, then stopped. It was the first time she mentioned her past directly. "My father insisted I learn to read and write well. He said it was important for making a good impression." Francisco nodded without pressing for more information. He had learned that she shared her memories like a cat approaching slowly, forcing. The process only resulted in withdrawal. "It's a valuable skill," he said simply. "Words have power." That night she wrote in her notebook, "Francisco sees me as I was before they broke me. I don't know if this is a gift or a responsibility." With October came the first frosts, and Francisco began preparing the house for winter. He checked the roof, sealed the windows, cut extra firewood for the fireplace. She helped where she could, holding tools, passing him nails, learning the domestic rhythms of one preparing to survive the cold months with dignity. One afternoon, while they stacked firewood in the shed, Francisco stopped and looked at her directly. "Winter will be hard," he said. "If you want to leave before the snow comes, I'll understand. But if you stay, you should know you'll be here until spring. The roads become impassable." It was a question disguised as a warning, an invitation wrapped in practical consideration. She understood that he was offering her an honorable exit if she didn't feel ready to commit to a prolonged stay. But he was also offering her something more, the security of guaranteed refuge, a place where she could stop running and begin planting roots. "I'll stay," she said without hesitation, and the words came out with a firmness that surprised her. Francisco smiled and continued stacking firewood. But she noticed that his movements had a new lightness, as if he too had been waiting for that answer without knowing he needed it. That night she wrote in her notebook, "Today I chose to stay instead of being rescued. I think it's the first real decision I've made since arriving here. It feels like learning to breathe again." The autumn wind whispered among the pines with promises of change, and for the first time in months, the nameless woman didn't fear what the future might bring. The first warning came with the golden leaves that October scattered along the paths like lost coins from a summer that resisted dying. It was a Tuesday when Don Aurelio Mendoza appeared at El Coyote Cantina, asking about a woman who matched exactly the description of the one who now shared Francisco Herrera's home. The news traveled through Tierra Blanca with the speed of wind through canyons. Soledad was the first to bring the information, presenting herself at the house on the hill with a basket of vegetables and an expression that mixed genuine concern with the inevitable excitement of gossip. "Don Francisco," she said while he unloaded firewood from the cart, "you need to know that yesterday a man arrived asking about the senora, a man with money and fine clothes accompanied by two cowboys. The nameless woman who had been hanging clothes in the patio froze with one of Francisco's shirts in her hands. The air seemed to become denser, charged with threats she believed she had left behind among the mountains. Francisco received the news with the calm that characterized all his gestures, but she noticed how his knuckles whitened as he gripped the axe handle. "What kind of questions was he asking?" he inquired. "He was asking about a young woman with brown hair and green eyes. He said she was his daughter and that she had fled home after a family misunderstanding. He offered money. For information." The shirt fell from the woman's numbed hands. "Family misunderstanding." The words struck her like slaps, reducing months of terror and pain to a simple domestic dispute that could be resolved with civilized conversation. "Did anyone tell him anything?" Francisco asked. Soledad shook her head. No one spoke. "But, Don Francisco, you can't keep her hidden forever. If this man is right and she's a minor—" "She's of age," interrupted the nameless woman, finding her voice amid the fear. "I'm 24 years old." It was the first time she had revealed her age, a personal detail she had guarded zealously until then. But the implication that she might be a minor, that her flight might be an adolescent's rebellion rather than an adult woman's desperation, filled her with an indignation that overcame terror. Soledad withdrew after assuring them she would keep her ears open, but her visit had left a palpable tension in the air. That night during dinner, neither spoke more than necessary. The fire crackled in the fireplace, but its flames seemed less capable of warming the cold that had settled in the room. It was Francisco who finally broke the silence. "You can tell me everything you want or nothing," he said. "But I need to know if you're here by your own will or if someone is holding you against your will." The question was fair, but it hurt. For weeks she had lived with the illusion that she could start over, that her past could remain buried under layers of peaceful days and dreamless nights. Now the past rose before her, like a mountain she had been climbing blindly. "I'm here because I chose to be here," she replied. "No one is holding me, no one forced me to do anything." Francisco nodded, but she saw in his eyes that he expected more. He deserved more after everything he had done for her. That night, while he read by the fire, she took her notebook and wrote the stories she had been avoiding. Not all of it. Some wounds were too deep to expose even to paper, but enough for Francisco to understand why she had fled and why she couldn't return. "My father is Don Aurelio Mendoza, owner of the San Cristobal Ranch in Coahuila. He planned to marry me to his business partner, Don Edmundo Vega, a 50-year-old man who had already buried 2 wives. When I refused, he said women don't have the right to choose, that my only function was to strengthen family alliances. When I continued refusing, he used other methods of persuasion. The scratch on my temple is the smallest reminder of those methods." Her hand trembled as she wrote, but she continued. "The night before the forced wedding, I took only what I could carry and fled. I didn't steal anything that wasn't mine by right. The clothes, some pesos I had saved from my monthly allowance, and this embroidered ribbon that was the last gift from my mother before she died. I'm not a rebellious girl. I'm an adult woman who chose freedom over respectable slavery." She tore the pages from the notebook and handed them to Francisco without a word. He read slowly, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he folded the sheets carefully and returned them. "Thank you for trusting me," he said. "And you're right. You're an adult woman who has the right to choose your own destiny." But they both knew that legal rights and social realities didn't always coincide. In 1882, Mexico fathers had almost absolute power over their unmarried daughters, especially when they had enough money to buy the cooperation of local authorities. The next day, Francisco went down to Tierra Blanca alone. When he returned at sunset, he brought news that confirmed their worst fears. "They've put up posters with your portrait," he said. "They're offering a considerable reward for information, leading to your safe return to the family bosom." The nameless woman felt the ground move under her feet. Her past had found her, and now every person in Tierra Blanca would know exactly who she was and how much she was worth delivering. "What are we going to do?" she asked, and the "we" left her lips before she could stop it. Francisco approached and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We're going to face whatever comes," he said. "Together. But first you need to decide something important." "What?" "You need to choose a name, your own name. Because when the time comes to face your father, you'll need to know exactly who you are now, not who you were before." That night, while the wind moaned among the pines, like the voices of all who had fled before her, the nameless woman took her notebook and wrote a single word on the blank page: Carmen. It was the name her maternal grandmother had borne a woman who, according to family stories, had been as fierce as she was beautiful. It was a name that spoke of passion and strength of women who didn't surrender without a fight. For the first time since arriving in Tierra Blanca, she knew who she was. Now she just needed to find the courage to defend herself against the man who had tried to decide her destiny without consulting her. Winter was approaching, but Carmen no longer feared the cold. She had found something more powerful than fear. She had found her name, and with it the strength to reclaim her life. Commissioner Rojas was a man who measured his authority in the precision of his waxed mustache and the impeccability of his navy blue uniform. When he appeared at Francisco Herrera's house, accompanied by two men in dark suits that contrasted dramatically with the rural landscape, Carmen knew the moment she had been fearing and expecting simultaneously had arrived. It was a Thursday morning, one of those November days, when the air is so clear that the mountains seem cut against the sky with celestial scissors. Carmen was kneading bread in the kitchen when she heard the sound of horse hooves climbing the trail. Her heart accelerated, but her hands didn't tremble. She had spent many nights preparing for this moment. Francisco went out to receive them with the naturalness of one who has nothing to hide. Carmen watched him from the window, admiring the way he maintained calm, while the visitors dismounted and shook the dust from their elegant clothes. "Don Francisco Herrera," said the commissioner with excessive formality, "we come on an official mission. We have reason to believe you're harboring Miss Carmen Mendoza, who has been reported missing by her family." "Carmen is here by her own will," Francisco replied. "She's of age and free to choose where to live. That will be determined by the competent authorities," intervened one of the suited men, a thin individual with glasses who seemed to measure each word before pronouncing it. "I am Attorney Vasquez, legal representative of Don Aurelio Mendoza. The young lady must accompany us to clarify her situation." Carmen took a deep breath, removed her apron, and left the house. The three men observed her with expressions ranging from official authority to professional curiosity. None looked at her as they saw Francisco, as an equal who deserved basic respect. "Gentlemen," she said with a firm voice, "I am Carmen Mendoza, and I'm here because I chose to be. I haven't been kidnapped or held against my will." Attorney Vasquez took some documents from his leather briefcase. "Miss Mendoza, your father is very concerned about your welfare. He has authorized these legal documents requiring your immediate return to the family home to clarify this misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. Again, that word that reduced her experience to a simple confusion that could be resolved with goodwill and civilized conversation. "There's no misunderstanding," Carmen replied. "I fled from a forced marriage and the violence that followed my refusal. I'm an adult woman and I have the right to choose my own destiny." Commissioner Rojas cleared his throat uncomfortably. It was evident he hadn't prepared to encounter articulated resistance. "Miss, family disputes must be resolved within the family. My duty is to ensure your safe return so you can dialogue with your father." "My father doesn't dialogue," Carmen said. "My father dictates orders and punishes disobedience." Francisco approached and positioned himself beside Carmen, not in front of her as a protector, but at her side as an ally. "Señora Carmen is my guest and is under my protection," he declared. "If you insist on taking her, it will be against her will and mine." Attorney Vasquez adjusted his glasses and smiled with the condescension of one accustomed to getting his way. "Don Francisco, I understand your chivalry, but this is a legal matter. If you interfere with the fulfillment of a judicial order, you could face serious charges." "May I see this judicial order?" Carmen asked. The attorney seemed surprised by the question. He clearly hadn't expected a rural woman to know her basic legal rights. "Of course," he said, handing her the documents with some reluctance. Carmen read carefully, silently thanking her governess for having taught her to interpret legal language. The documents were impressive in appearance, full of official seals and grandiose language, but in essence, they were a paternal petition for the return of a lost daughter, not a judicial order with real legal force. "This isn't a judicial order," she said, returning the papers. "It's a petition, and as an adult woman, I have the right to reject it." The attorney's face hardened. "Miss Mendoza, you're making a grave error. Your father has the means to make this matter very complicated for you and for anyone who helps you." The threat floated in the air like toxic smoke. Carmen felt Francisco tense beside her, but she remained calm. She had lived with threats for so long that they no longer had the power to paralyze her. "Are you threatening me, attorney?" she asked. In front of the commissioner. Rojas shifted uncomfortably. It was clear he didn't want to be caught between a family dispute involving people with money and power. "Miss," he intervened, "it would be easier for everyone if you simply accompanied them to clarify this matter. I'm sure a reasonable agreement can be reached." Carmen looked him directly in the eyes. "Commissioner Rojas, under what specific legal authority are you asking me to leave this place? Have I committed a crime? Is there an arrest warrant against me?" The silence that followed was eloquent. Finally, the commissioner admitted, "No, miss, there are no charges against you." "Then I have no legal obligation to go anywhere," Carmen concluded. "And I choose to stay here." Attorney Vasquez put away the documents with brusque movements that betrayed his frustration. "This doesn't end here, Miss Mendoza. Your father has resources and influence. He can make life very difficult in this region for those who oppose his wishes." "I understand," Carmen replied, "but I prefer a difficult life in freedom to an easy life in prison." The three men withdrew without more words, but their faces promised they would return. Carmen and Francisco watched them ride away until their figures disappeared around the curve of the path. "Do you think they'll come back?" Francisco asked. "Yes," Carmen replied, "but next time we'll be better prepared." That night, Carmen wrote in her notebook, "Today I defended my right to exist as a complete person. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Francisco didn't try to speak for me or rescue me. He allowed me to fight my own battle while supporting me. I think this is what true respect means." But they both knew the battle had only begun. Don Aurelio Mendoza wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and he had the money and connections to make resistance very costly. However, for the first time since her flight, Carmen didn't feel alone facing the power that had tried to control her life. She had a name, she had a voice, and she had someone who respected her enough to allow her to fight her own battles. Winter was approaching, but Carmen no longer feared the cold. She had discovered she had her own fire. Snow had begun to fall on the mountains when Don Aurelio Mendoza personally arrived in Tierra Blanca. He didn't come alone. He was accompanied by Commissioner Rojas, Attorney Vasquez, and 4 armed men who dressed like cowboys, but moved with the precision of professional soldiers. It was a display of power designed to intimidate anyone who might interpose themselves between him and his objective. Carmen saw them approaching from the kitchen window. Her father rode a black horse that seemed to have been chosen specifically to complement the severity of his presence. He was a tall, corpulent man with a silver mustache and eyes that had learned to see people as property to manage rather than human beings to respect. Francisco was repairing the stable roof when he heard the noise of horses. He descended the ladder with deliberate movements, without haste, but with determination. Carmen left the house and positioned herself beside him, not behind him. This time she wouldn't hide. Don Aurelio dismounted with the arrogance of one accustomed to the world reorganizing itself to accommodate his presence. His eyes found Carmen, and lingered there with a mixture of relief and fury that made the air seem to become denser. "Carmen Esperanza Mendoza," he said, using her full name as if it were an accusation. 3 months searching for you. 3 months of worry and humiliation. 3 months of freedom, she replied. "The best of my life." Don Aurelio's face hardened. He had clearly expected to find a repentant daughter, not a woman who had developed the capacity to look him in the eyes without blinking. "This is the gratitude you show after everything I've done for you. After the education you received, the social position I gave you. You gave me an education that allowed me to recognize my own slavery," Carmen replied. "And the social position you describe was that of human merchandise in a commercial marriage." Don Aurelio turned to Francisco with the look of a man accustomed to solving problems by eliminating obstacles. "You are Francisco Herrera," he said. "I've investigated. Fido are no family owner of a small property in the mountains. What's the price of your cooperation?" The insult implicit in the question floated in the air like toxic smoke. Francisco remained motionless, but Carmen saw how the muscles in his jaw tensed. "My cooperation is not for sale," Francisco replied, "and Carmen is here by her own decision." "Carmen doesn't have the legal age to make decisions of this magnitude," declared Don Aurelio. "She's my daughter and my responsibility." "I'm 24 years old," Carmen said. "I'm of age under any Mexican law." Don Aurelio looked at her, as if he had just discovered that his most precious property had developed the ability to speak for itself. "Legal age or not, you continue being my daughter. Your duty is to obey me and honor the commitments I've made in your name." "My duty is to myself," Carmen replied. "And my commitment is to my own dignity." Commissioner Rojas cleared his throat nervously. "Don Aurelio, perhaps if we could all sit down and discuss this civilly." "There's nothing to discuss," interrupted Don Aurelio. "Carmen returns with me today, by good or by force." "By force." "Then," Carmen said, and her voice had a firmness that surprised even Francisco. From her dress she extracted the notebook in which she had been writing for months. It was a small object, apparently insignificant, but Don Aurelio's reaction suggested he understood exactly what it represented. "What is that?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice betrayed uncertainty. "My story," Carmen replied. "Every detail of why I fled every method you used to try to force me into marriage, every blow, every threat, every moment. You tried to break my will. It's all here written in my own hand." Don Aurelio's face visibly paled. "Those are lies, slanders from an ungrateful daughter." "They are documented facts," Carmen said, "and I have witnesses. Dr. Herrera from Saltillo, who treated my wounds. Sister Maria from the Convent of Mercy, who offered me refuge the night before my flight. Your own butler, Esteban Morales, who witnessed—" "Enough!" roared Don Aurelio. "What do you want?" Carmen smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had learned to recognize their own power. "I want you to leave," she said. "I want you never to return. I want you to tell Don Edmundo Vega to seek a wife elsewhere. And I want you to understand that if you ever try to force me to return, this story will be published in every newspaper from here to Mexico City. You wouldn't dare dishonor the family name." "It's no longer my family name," Carmen replied. "I've chosen a new name, a new life, a new family." She approached Francisco and took his hand. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a political declaration, an affirmation that she had chosen her own alliance. Don Aurelio looked at his daughter's joined hand and that of the man who had protected her, and something in his expression changed. The fury transformed into something more like painful recognition of a reality he couldn't change. "You really prefer this?" he asked, gesturing toward the modest house, the arid mountains, the simple life Carmen had chosen. "You prefer rural poverty over the wealth and position you could have?" "I prefer freedom over golden slavery," Carmen replied. "I prefer respect over forced obedience. I prefer choosing my own destiny over living what others designed for me." Don Aurelio remained silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all its previous authority. Very well, he said. You've chosen your path. But understand this, from today you no longer have a father. You no longer have a home on my ranch. You no longer have the right to the Mendoza name or to the inheritance that would correspond to my daughter. Understood, Carmen replied, and I accept those consequences. Don Aurelio mounted his horse with rigid movements that betrayed his age and pain. Before riding away, he looked at her one last time. Your mother would be ashamed, he said. My mother would be proud, Carmen replied. She also dreamed of being free. The men rode away without more words, their figures shrinking against the landscape until they finally disappeared behind a curve in the path. Carmen and Francisco remained motionless until the sound of hooves faded completely. Are you all right? Francisco asked. Carmen nodded, but her legs trembled slightly as the adrenaline from the confrontation began to dissipate. I'm free, she said. Finally, completely free. That night, while writing in her notebook by the fire, Carmen reflected on what she had lost and what she had gained. She had lost a father, a fortune, a social position, the security that comes with inherited wealth, but she had gained something infinitely more valuable: complete ownership of her own life. Francisco read beside her, occasionally looking up to observe how the firelight illuminated her peaceful face. For the first time since Rosa and Isabel had died, he felt complete. Not because Carmen had filled the void they had left, no one could do that, but because he had found a new reason to build a future instead of simply surviving the present. Winter had arrived, but inside the house it was warm. And for the first time in months, Carmen slept without nightmares, without her father's shadow lurking in her dreams. She was truly free, and that freedom had a sweeter taste than any wealth she could have inherited. Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally appeared, it did so with a generosity that compensated for the wait. The pines filled with tender, green-shoot streams descended singing from the mountains carrying melted snow, and the air was perfumed with the aroma of wildflowers that sprouted among the rocks like small miracles of color. Carmen awakened on the first day of April, knowing that something had changed in her during the night. It wasn't something she could point to specifically. No dramatic event had occurred. She hadn't received mystical revelations, but she felt as if she had shed an old skin and emerged with a new one that fit her perfectly. Francisco was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she left her room. During the winter months, they had developed a domestic intimacy that was deeper than passion and more lasting than lust. They shared space with the naturalness of two people who had learned to move around each other without friction, like dancers who knew their partner's steps perfectly. Good morning, he said without turning from the stove. Did you sleep well? Like never before, she replied, and was surprised by the absolute truth of that statement. During breakfast, Carmen studied Francisco's face while he read a delayed newspaper he had obtained on his last visit to town. The months had softened the lines of permanent pain around his eyes, replacing them with gentler wrinkles that spoke of occasional laughter and daily peace. Francisco, she said finally, I need to tell you something. He looked up from the newspaper, giving her his complete attention in that way he had of making people feel their words mattered. Yesterday, I faced my father as Carmen Mendoza, she continued. But I no longer want to be Carmen Mendoza. I want to be simply Carmen. Carmen without a surname, Carmen who belongs to herself, Carmen who chooses her own family. Francisco smiled, but it was a cautious smile like that of someone who doesn't want to presume too much. And what kind of family does Carmen want to choose? He asked. She extended her hand across the table, palm up, an invitation and a silent question. Francisco looked at the hand for a moment, that stretched like honey, then placed his over it, intertwining their fingers with a gentleness that spoke of promises that didn't need words. The one we already have, Carmen replied. I just want it to be official. Are you sure? Francisco asked. I can't offer you wealth or social position. This house, this land is all I have. It's all I want, Carmen replied. Well, almost all. What else do you want? Carmen stood and went to the wardrobe, where she kept her few personal possessions. From there she extracted the silk ribbon embroidered with the letter C that she had kept throughout her flight, the only tangible link to her previous life. I want to burn this, she said. I want us to witness how Carmen Mendoza disappears forever." Francisco immediately understood the ritual importance of the gesture. He stood and lit the fire in the fireplace, though the morning was warm and they didn't need heating. Carmen held the ribbon over the flames for a moment, feeling the weight of everything it represented, the obedient girl she had been, the daughter, who had tried to fulfill impossible expectations, the woman who had defined her value through male approval. "Goodbye," she murmured and let the silk fall into the fire. The ribbon twisted and blackened, releasing a thin smoke that rose through the chimney like a prayer. When the last fibers converted to ash, Carmen felt a physical lightness, as if she had literally released a weight she had been carrying on her shoulders for years. Now Francisco said, "How do you want to be called officially?" Carmen smiled, and this time it was a completely new smile without shadows from the past. "Carmen Herrera," she said, "if you'll have me as your wife." "I want you as everything," Francisco replied, "as companion, as equal, as the woman who taught me that the heart can heal without forgetting." That afternoon they walked together to town to speak with Father Miguel. The priest received them in the church with a smile that suggested he had been expecting this visit for months. "Father," Francisco said, "we want to get married." "Do you have documents?" Father Miguel asked. But his tone suggested it was a routine question. "Carmen is no longer connected to her previous family," Francisco explained. "She's chosen to start completely anew." Father Miguel nodded with understanding. He was a man who had seen many forms of human suffering and had learned that mercy was more important than bureaucracy. "Carmen," he asked, "are you certain this decision comes from your free heart without coercion or desperation?" "It comes from my free heart," Carmen replied, "and from my clear mind. Francisco taught me what it means to be respected as a complete person. I want to build a life with him based on that foundation." "Then I'll marry you," Father Miguel said, "next Sunday." They left the church as an officially engaged couple, but Carmen felt as if she had been married to Francisco since the moment he had chased away the men from the abandoned shed. The paper would only confirm what their hearts already knew. That night Francisco gave her a silver brooch in the shape of a flower that he had secretly commissioned from the blacksmith. "To remember that the most beautiful flowers grow in soil that has been plowed by difficulty," he said, while pinning it to her dress. Carmen touched the brooch with fingers that no longer trembled. "And Rosa and Isabel?" she asked. "How would they feel about this?" Francisco looked toward the window in the direction of the hill where his first wife and daughter rested. "I think they would be happy to know I learned to love again without forgetting them," he said. "And I think Rosa especially would be proud of the brave woman who chose our family." Carmen wrote in her notebook that night, "Today I died and was born on the same day." Carmen Mendoza was buried with honor, and Carmen Herrera breathed her first breath as a free woman. "I chose a name, a family, a future. For the first time in my life, I belong completely to myself. And from that complete ownership, I can choose to share my life with someone who sees me as I am, not as property to manage." Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the aroma of spring flowers. Carmen dressed in a new dress she had sewn especially for the occasion, using the navy blue fabric Francisco had bought months ago. It was simple but elegant, the dress of a woman who knew her own worth. Father Miguel married them in a small but beautiful ceremony with Soledad and Rafael as witnesses. When they exchanged vows, Carmen promised to love, honor, and respect, but not obey. Francisco promised to protect, support, and respect, but not possess. When Father Miguel declared them husband and wife, Carmen felt the world reorganize itself around her, not to accommodate others' desires, but to celebrate her own choice of happiness. That night, as Carmen Herrera, she slept beside the man she had chosen, not because she needed him to be complete, but because she had chosen to share the fullness each had found individually. Winter had ended, spring had bloomed, and Carmen had finally arrived home in her own life. Summer brought with it an abundance that Carmen had never experienced, not because the harvests were especially generous, but because for the first time in her life, she was living the fruits of decisions she had made freely. The garden she had, planted with Francisco, bloomed with an exuberance that surprised even the most experienced neighbors. The tomatoes grew red and heavy on their plants, squash spread across the ground like generous green hands, and aromatic herbs perfumed the air, with promises of meals that tasted of home. Carmen had discovered she had hands for the earth. Each morning before the sun became too intense, she went out to the garden with a basket and lost herself among the plants, talking to them in a low voice while she tended them. Francisco watched. Her from the kitchen window marveled by the way things grew under her care, as if the plants sensed they had finally found someone who understood what it meant to put down roots after being transplanted. One July morning, while Carmen was pruning the wild roses that had appeared spontaneously near the house, she heard children's voices approaching along the trail. She straightened, shielding her eyes from the sun with her hand, and saw 3 children from town climbing the hill with cautious steps. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10 years old, a dark-haired girl with braided hair, who held the hand of a smaller boy, while another boy of intermediate age walked slightly behind them. Carmen recognized them. They had been some of those who observed her with curiosity during her visits to town, but they had never approached. "Good morning," she said to them, using the same gentle tone she employed with the plants. "How may I help you?" The oldest girl stepped forward with the determination of one chosen as spokesperson. "Señora Carmen," she said with careful formality, "my grandmother Soledad says you read very well and that perhaps you could teach us." Carmen felt something warm expand in her chest. For weeks, she had been observing the town children. During her market visits, noticing how some of them looked longingly at the books and newspapers that occasionally appeared in the general store. "Do your parents know you're here?" she asked. "Yes, señora," the girl replied. "My papa says if anyone's going to teach us, it better be someone who knows what it's like to live without being able to choose anything." The words struck Carmen with unexpected force. In the child's simple mind, or perhaps in her father's wisdom, there was a deep understanding of why education was freedom, and why someone who had fought for their own freedom could better understand the value of teaching others to fight for theirs. "What are your names?" Carmen asked. "I'm Maria Elena," said the oldest girl. "This is my brother Pedro, and he's our cousin Joaquin." "Pleased to meet you," Carmen replied. "What would you like to learn?" "Everything," Pedro said, with the devastating honesty of childhood. "We want to know everything that's in books." Carmen looked toward the house where Francisco had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the voices. He smiled at her and nodded, and in that gesture she read not only approval, but understanding that she had found something she didn't know. She was looking for a way to use her educational privilege for something greater than her own survival. "Very well," Carmen said. "If you come every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon after you finish your chores, I'll teach you to read and write. And when you learn that, I'll teach you numbers and geography and everything I can remember of what they taught me." The children exchanged looks of incredulity and joy. It was as if they had just received promises of unimaginable treasures. "You won't charge us?" Joaquin asked. "No," Carmen replied. "Education isn't sold, it's shared." That afternoon began a new routine in the house on the hill. Carmen cleaned the room she had been using as a sewing workshop and transformed it into an improvised school. Francisco built small wooden benches and a rudimentary blackboard using a board painted black. Carmen wrote the letters of the alphabet on individual cards, each decorated with small drawings that would help the children remember the sounds. The first lesson was magical in its simplicity. Carmen wrote each child's name on the board and watched as their eyes lit up, recognizing that those symbols represented their own identities. Maria Elena traced the letters of her name in the air again and again, as if she were learning to sign her existence in the universe. Soon other children began to appear. News that Señora Carmen taught without cost spread through Tierra Blanca like water on dry ground. Children of merchants, farmers, the washerwoman and the carpenter arrived. Carmen never rejected any, though it meant lessons extended until nightfall, and she had to prepare educational material until late hours. Francisco helped when he could, especially with practical mathematics, teaching the older children to calculate harvests, measure land, understand basic commercial transactions. The children adored him because he never spoke down to them and because his examples always came from real situations they could understand. One August afternoon, Carmen was reviewing exercise notebooks when Maria Elena approached with a serious expression. "Señora Carmen," she said, "my older sister Rosa says she doesn't understand why you do this. She says rich women like you don't, need to work." Carmen set down the notebook she was reviewing and looked directly at the girl. "Do you think I'm rich, Maria Elena?" The girl shrugged. "You have pretty dresses and know how to read big books." "Yes, I have those things," Carmen admitted. "But do you know what real wealth is? It's being able to choose what to do with your life. For many years I couldn't choose anything. Other people decided for me what to wear, what to eat, whom to marry, how to live. Now I can choose, and I choose. To teach you because you deserve to have the same options I have now." Maria Elena nodded with the seriousness of an adult. "And Don Francisco. Does he also choose?" "Don Francisco chooses to love me and support me," Carmen replied, "and I choose to love him and support him. We make decisions together about important things, but each of us is free to be who we really are." That night, Carmen wrote in her notebook, "I've discovered that freedom isn't something you obtain once and keep in a safe. Freedom is something you practice every day, and it becomes more real each time you share it with someone else. Every child who learns to read is a small revolution. Every mind that opens is a victory against the ignorance that keeps us chained." In September, Carmen received an unexpected letter. A traveling merchant had brought it from Saltillo. It was from Sister Maria from the Convent of Mercy, the nun who had tried to help her the night before her flight. "Dear Carmen," the letter said, "news has reached me that you found refuge and began a new life. I wanted you to know that your courage inspired another young woman who arrived at our convent in a similar situation. When I told her your story, she found the courage to also reject a forced marriage. She's now teaching at a school for girls in Monterrey. Thank you for showing us that it's possible to escape and build something beautiful from the ashes of fear." Carmen read the letter 3 times, feeling how each word planted seeds of understanding in her heart. Her story hadn't ended with her own liberation. Like waves in a lake, her decision to flee had touched other lives, had given courage to other. Women had created possibilities that hadn't existed before. That night under the stars that shone over the mountains, like promises of futures not yet written, Carmen finally understood why she had had to travel the difficult path that brought her to Tierra Blanca, not just to save herself, but to learn that real salvation comes when you use your freedom to create more freedom in the world. Autumn was approaching, but Carmen no longer feared seasonal changes. She had learned that beautiful things can grow in any climate as long as they have deep enough roots and brave enough hearts to continue seeking the light. Autumn 1883 arrived painted in golden tones that converted the mountains into a tapestry of light and shadow. Carmen had established her new life so firmly that sometimes she was surprised to realize only a year had passed since her arrival in Tierra Blanca. Time seemed to have expanded, filling with experiences that made each day feel like a complete life in itself. The improvised school had grown beyond her most optimistic expectations. 23 children regularly attended classes, and Carmen had had to reorganize the schedule to accommodate different skill levels. The most advanced could now read complete paragraphs and write letters to relatives living in distant towns. The smallest were just beginning to trace their first letters, but they did so with such intense concentration that Carmen sometimes felt she was witnessing small miracles of determination. But it was one October afternoon when an unexpected visitor appeared that changed the direction of everything Carmen had been building. She was a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, who climbed the trail toward the house with hesitant steps that spoke of physical and emotional exhaustion. She wore a dress that had once been elegant, but now showed signs of hard travel and poor care. Her blonde hair was partially covered by a worn shawl, and she carried a small suitcase that seemed to contain all her worldly possessions. Carmen saw her approaching from the kitchen window and felt an instant recognition that had nothing to do with having seen her before, but with recognizing in her the echo of her own past desperation. She went out to receive her before the woman reached the door. "Good morning," Carmen said softly. "May I help you with something?" The woman looked up, and Carmen saw blue eyes marked by the kind of tiredness that comes from months of constant hypervigilance. There was something in her posture, The way she kept her shoulders tense, how she held the suitcase against her body like a shield that spoke directly to Carmen's memories. "Are you Señora Carmen Herrera?" she asked in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Yes," Carmen replied. "How may I help you?" "I'm Esperanza Morales," the woman said. "Sister Maria from the Convent of Mercy told me that perhaps that you might understand." She didn't finish the sentence, but Carmen didn't need to hear more. In Esperanza's eyes, she read the entire story. She couldn't articulate the desperate flight, the days of terror, the search for a place where she could breathe without fear. "Come in," Carmen said gently, taking the suitcase from Esperanza's hands. "You're safe here." Francisco appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the voices. He assessed the situation with a glance and nodded to Carmen before withdrawing discreetly, instinctively understanding that this was a conversation that needed feminine space. Carmen prepared tea, while Esperanza sat at the kitchen table, her eyes constantly moving toward the windows and door, like those of someone who had learned that safety could disappear at any moment. "How long have you been traveling?" Carmen asked, placing a cup of hot tea before Esperanza. 3 weeks, Esperanza replied, "from Guadalajara." "And before that?" "All my life in my uncle's house," Esperanza said, and her voice became even smaller. "After my parents died of fever, he took charge of me. He said he was my protector, but—" She stopped, unable to continue, but Carmen understood. There was enough pain in those incomplete words to fill volumes. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Carmen said, "but if you want to talk, I'm here to listen." Esperanza drank her tea in small sips, as if she were remembering how to savor something without fear. Gradually, with frequent pauses and carefully chosen words, she told her story. It was different from Carmen's in details: an abusive uncle instead of a controlling father, physical violence instead of forced marriage, but identical in essential elements: a young woman trapped in a situation of unequal power fighting to reclaim her autonomy in a world that denied her the right to decide about her own life. "Sister Maria told me you had managed to build a new life," Esperanza said. "She told me you had found a way to be free without having to keep running forever." Carmen felt the weight of responsibility those words brought with them. Somehow, without seeking it, she had become a symbol of hope for other women in similar situations. It was an honor that humbled and terrified her simultaneously. "Freedom isn't something you find," Carmen said carefully. "It's something you build day by day, decision by decision, and it's built more easily when you don't do it alone." That night, after Esperanza had slept in the guest room, Carmen had prepared. She and Francisco spoke in low voices by the fire. "She can't stay here permanently," Francisco said, not with harshness, but with the practical realism Carmen had learned to value. "Not because she's not welcome, but because she needs to find her own path, not live in the shadow of yours." "I know," Carmen replied, "but maybe she can stay long enough to find her strength, like I did with you." Francisco looked at her with the gentle smile he had learned to associate with their moments of greatest mutual understanding. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Carmen took her notebook and wrote a single word: refuge. "I'm thinking that maybe what we've built here can be bigger than just the two of us," she said. "Maybe we can create a place where women like Esperanza can come not just to hide, but to learn how to build new lives." During the following weeks, while Esperanza recovered physically and emotionally, Carmen developed an idea that had been germinating in her subconscious since she had begun teaching the children. With Francisco's help, she designed a plan to transform part of their property into something that still had no formal name, but which in her heart she called the Healing Circle. They built a small but dignified cabin behind the main house using pine wood, Francisco cut from his own land. It wasn't luxurious, but it had everything a woman needed to live independently: a room with bed and wardrobe, a small kitchen, a space to work. "What is this for?" Esperanza asked while watching the construction. "For women like us," Carmen replied. "Women who need time and space to discover who they are when no one else is making decisions for them." In November, Carmen wrote a letter to Father Miguel Commissioner Rojas Soledad and several other respected members of the Tierra Blanca community. In the letter, she explained her purpose: to create a temporary refuge for women who had fled abusive situations where they could recover, learn practical skills and plan independent futures. The response was mixed as she had expected. Some saw value in the idea, especially the women in the community who had silently observed their own versions of domestic oppression. Others expressed concern about attracting outside problems to their tranquil town. But Carmen had learned she didn't need universal approval to do good. She only needed the determination to begin and the wisdom to continue step by step. The first official resident of the refuge arrived in December, an older woman named Refugio, a name Carmen took as a sign she was on the right path, who had fled from an adult son who mistreated her and stole her widow's pension. By spring 1884, 3 women lived in small cabins. Francisco had built with help from some townsmen who had begun to see value in the project. Carmen taught them to read and write. Francisco taught them practical skills like basic carpentry and money management. And among them all, they had created a community garden that produced enough food to sustain the small community. One afternoon, while Carmen worked in the garden alongside Esperanza, who had decided to stay as the first graduate who became an assistant, she realized she had accidentally found her true purpose in life. It wasn't just surviving or even being happy. It was using her freedom to create more freedom, using her healing to facilitate more healing, using her story as a bridge for other women to cross from despair toward hope. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "Today, I understood that escaping was only the first step. The second step was healing. The third step was building a new life. But the fourth step, the most important, is making the path easier for those who come behind. I didn't just save my own life. I'm saving the life I could have been, the life where I never learned I had options. And by saving it, I'm creating options for others." The mountains around Tierra Blanca had witnessed many stories of survival throughout the centuries, but now they were witnessing something different, a story of transformation, where personal pain converted into collective purpose, where individual freedom flourished until it became community liberation. Carmen looked toward the hill where Rosa and Isabel rested and felt they too were part of this healing circle. Their death had taught Francisco the value of life. Their love had taught Carmen it was possible to be honored for who she was not, for what she could provide. The legacy of all the women who had suffered before her was becoming hope for all the women who would come after, and that Carmen knew was the most beautiful way to honor both pain and survival. By winter 1884, what had begun as an improvised refuge had evolved into something Carmen had never imagined, a silent but powerful network of women extending far beyond the mountains of Tierra Blanca, connecting towns and cities in a system of mutual support that functioned through letters, whispered recommendations, and acts of courage that multiplied like waves in still water. The transformation had begun with a simple wooden box Francisco had built and Carmen had placed by the main entrance of her house. On it she had put a sign written in her careful handwriting, "For those who arrive without a name here, you'll find refuge. For those who leave with a new name here, leave hope for the next one." The box contained letters, testimonies written by women who had spent time at the refuge before continuing their paths toward independent lives. Each letter was a light in the darkness, for newcomers tangible proof that flight was not only possible, but could lead to happiness they had previously believed impossible. Elena Vasquez had arrived in October, fleeing from a marriage where her husband beat her every time food wasn't ready, exactly when he returned from the cantina. She had stayed 3 months learning to read enough to get work as an independent seamstress in the neighboring town of Santa Rosa. Her letter in the box said, "Dear sister who arrives after me, your hands can learn to create beauty instead of just cleaning blood. Your eyes can learn to see opportunities instead of just seeking refuge. You are stronger than you believe, more valuable than they told you, freer than seems possible. With love and respect, Elena." Maria Soledad Herrera, she had taken Francisco's surname as a symbol of her new chosen family, had arrived from Durango after her father tried to literally sell her to a cattle dealer to pay gambling debts. She now taught at a girls' school in Zacatecas. Her letter was more practical. "Sister, learn to handle money before you leave. Learn to negotiate prices at the market. Learn that your work is worth a fair wage. Independence is built with small skills that accumulate until they become real freedom. Don't be afraid to ask for what you're worth. But the letter that most moved Carmen had recently arrived from Mexico City, sent by a woman who signed simply as C, a doctor who now worked in a public hospital treating poor women. Dear Carmen and Francisco, it said, I never met you personally, but your story reached me through Sister Maria when I most needed to hear that it was possible to change the course of a life apparently destined for suffering. Now every woman I treat at the hospital hears from me that she has options, that her body belongs to her, that her life belongs to her. The circle expands. With eternal gratitude, C. Carmen had framed that letter and hung it on the wall of the refuge's main cabin. It was proof that her work had transcended the geographical limits of Tierra Blanca to become part of a broader change in how women saw themselves and their possibilities. The refuge now included 5 small cabins, a workshop where women learned marketable skills like sewing, weaving, and food preparation for sale, and an improvised library where Carmen had gathered all the books she could obtain about trade's history, basic medicine and literature that showed strong women as protagonists of their own stories. Francisco had turned out to be not just a supportive companion, but an active ally in the cause. He had learned to build small furniture that women could sell in local markets, and had developed connections with honest merchants in neighboring towns who were willing to pay fair prices for the artisanal work the refuge produced. One January morning, while Carmen taught basic mathematics to a mixed group of town children and refuge women, she received a visit that would again change the direction of everything she had built. It was an older distinguished man who arrived in an elegant carriage pulled by 2 well-cared-for horses. He wore a black suit that spoke of respectable professionalism and carried a leather briefcase that suggested official business. Carmen felt the familiar tug of anxiety in her stomach. Official visit still awakened echoes of fear, but reminded herself she was no longer the nameless woman who had arrived running to Tierra Blanca. The man introduced himself as Attorney Martinez, and came from the state capital with a proposal she would never have imagined. Señora Herrera, he said, removing his hat with genuine respect, I come representing a group of progressive women from Mexico City. They've heard about your work here and would like to propose something extraordinary to you. Carmen received him in the main room of her house serving coffee, while Francisco sat beside her, not as a protector but as a witness and counselor. The refuge women had withdrawn discreetly, but Carmen knew they would be listening from the windows, as curious as she about this unexpected visit. What kind of proposal? Carmen asked. Attorney Martinez opened his briefcase and extracted several carefully prepared documents. A group of politicians and businessmen's wives has formed an organization called the Protective Society of Destitute Women. They have funds, political influence and support from some progressive government members. They want to establish formal refuges throughout the country and would like you to direct the project. Carmen felt as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis. What had begun as a personal response to her own survival had become something significant enough to attract attention from the capital. Why me? She asked. Because you're not a rich benefactor playing at helping the poor, the attorney replied with frankness that surprised her. You're someone who lived what these women live. Your credibility comes from your experience, not from your social position. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it would also mean abandoning everything she had built in Tierra Blanca. Carmen knew she was facing a decision that would change not only her life, but potentially the lives of countless women throughout Mexico. The future called from Mexico City, but the mountains of Tierra Blanca whispered promises of peace and continuity. It was time to choose again, and this time the choice would determine not only her personal destiny, but the scope of her mission of freedom. That night, Carmen and Francisco walked to the hill where Rosa and Isabel rested. It was a custom they had developed when they needed to make important decisions, going to the place where life and death met, where temporal perspectives became clearer. What do you think? Francisco asked. I think I'm afraid, Carmen replied honestly. I'm afraid of leaving this place that has become my home. I'm afraid that large-scale work will corrupt what we've built here. But I'm also afraid of wasting an opportunity to help more women than I could ever reach from Tierra Blanca. Francisco took her hand. And what does your heart say? Carmen closed her eyes and listened. She heard the wind in the pine's water running in distant streams, the voices of women in the cabins preparing for sleep. But she also heard something more, the voices of women she didn't know, in places she had never visited, who might need what she had learned to offer. My heart says that home isn't a place, she said finally. Home is what you build with the people you love. And if we can build more homes for more people, then that's your answer, Francisco said. Carmen looked at Rosa and Isabel's graves illuminated by moonlight. Do you think I'm betraying what we built here? Francisco followed her gaze. I think Rosa would understand that some seeds are destined to travel far to be able to create roots in new lands. And I think Isabel would be proud to know that a strong woman is using her freedom to create more freedom. The next day, Carmen convened a meeting with all the refugee women. She explained the offer and asked them what they thought she should do. You should go, Esperanza said without hesitation. We can keep this place running. We've learned everything you taught us. But how will you know you're ready? Carmen asked. The same way you knew you were ready to create this, replied Maria Elena, the girl who was now 12, and had learned to read so well, she helped teach the smaller ones. When something is necessary, you find a way to do it. Carmen felt a wave of maternal pride toward all the people whose lives she had touched and who were now ready to continue the work without her. That night she wrote in her notebook, Today, I learned the most difficult lesson about motherhood, whether of biological children or heart projects. The best measure of success isn't how much they need you, but how well they can flourish when you're no longer there to care for them. Tierra Blanca taught me to plant roots. Now it's time to learn to scatter seeds. 2 weeks later, Carmen and Francisco temporarily closed their house in the mountains and departed for Mexico City, taking with them not just their clothes and possessions, but a complete system for creating refugees that had been proven in practice and refined through real experience. Mexico City in 1885 was a cauldron of contrasts that struck the senses like a chaotic symphony. Colonial buildings rose beside modern constructions, elegant carriages shared the streets with donkeys loaded with merchandise, and the aroma of fresh tortillas mixed with smoke from the first factories beginning to transform the urban landscape. Carmen adapted to the city with the same methodical determination she had used to rebuild her life in Tierra Blanca. But the scale of the work ahead overwhelmed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The Protective Society of Destitute Women had established offices in an elegant mansion in the city center, complete with servants' reception rooms and enough bureaucracy to administer a small government. Doña Esperanza de Villarreal, the society's president, was a 50-year-old woman with silk dresses from Paris and steel determination inherited from a family lineage of women who had learned to exercise power in a world that officially denied it to them. She received Carmen with a mixture of genuine curiosity and careful evaluation. Señora Herrera, she said during their first formal meeting, I must admit your reputation precedes you. We have reports of at least 12 women who found new life after spending time at your Tierra Blanca refuge. Carmen adjusted the new dress she had bought for the occasion, something more formal than her rural clothes, but not so elegant as to seem like she was trying to imitate society ladies. The women found new life because they were ready to find it, she replied. I just provided them a safe place where they could discover their own strengths. Exactly the attitude we hoped for, smiled Doña Esperanza. Not a savior, but a facilitator. During the following weeks, Carmen immersed herself in a completely different world from what she had known. She attended meetings where budgets of thousands of pesos were discussed, reviewed legal proposals to establish refugees with official status under government protection, and learned to navigate the political complexities of work that required as much diplomacy as passion. Francisco found his own place in the organization, applying his practical skills to design the physical aspects of the refugees they planned to build. His experience in rural construction proved invaluable for creating spaces that were both functional and economical, But it was during a visit to the city's poor neighborhoods that Carmen truly understood the magnitude of what they were trying to address. Accompanied by a social worker named Luz Maria Herrera, no relation to Francisco, but someone whose shared surname felt like a good omen. Carmen visited neighborhoods where women lived in conditions that made her own experience of oppression seem like relative privilege. They found women working 16 hours a day in textile factories for wages that could barely sustain life, mothers selling their bodies to feed their children because no other work was available, widows who had lost their homes when their husbands died because women couldn't inherit property under existing laws. During the following months, Carmen developed a completely new model for the society's work. Instead of simply creating refuges where women could hide from abusive situations, she proposed integral centers that would combine temporary shelter, vocational education, legal support, and microfinancing programs that would allow women to eventually establish themselves as independent merchants or artisans. The proposal was revolutionary, but also expensive and politically complicated. It required not just money, but changes in fundamental social attitudes about women's role in Mexican society. After months of intense work developing the program, Carmen made a bold decision. Instead of responding to criticism through newspaper editorials or through the society's official channels, she decided to face criticism head-on by organizing a public presentation about the program open to anyone who wanted to attend. "Are you sure about this?" Francisco asked when she told him about her plan. "You'll be putting yourself in a very vulnerable position." "I've been in vulnerable positions before," Carmen replied. "The difference is that now I have facts, allies, and a mission. That's bigger than my personal safety." The presentation was scheduled for the following Sunday in the courtyard of San Francisco Church, with permission from the Superior Father, who had become a supporter of the society's work after seeing how it had helped some women from his own parish. Carmen spent the week preparing, but not in the way others expected. Instead of writing a defensive speech about why her work was morally acceptable, she prepared a detailed presentation about the economic benefits the program was bringing to families and communities. "I'm not going to argue about whether women should be allowed to be independent," she told Francisco the night before the presentation. "I'm going to demonstrate that independent women create stronger families and more prosperous communities." The day of the presentation dawned clear and warm, with a breeze that carried the aroma of orange blossoms from the gardens surrounding the church. When Carmen arrived, she was surprised to find the courtyard already filled with people, men and women young and old, some dressed in fine clothes and others in the simple clothing of working families. When Carmen began her presentation, the crowd fell silent. She had prepared carefully, but standing there before all those people she felt the familiar tremor of nervousness that had once paralyzed her. Then she looked toward the back of the crowd and saw Francisco's encouraging smile, and suddenly remembered she was no longer the frightened woman running from her father's house. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtyard. "I am Carmen Herrera, and I'm here to talk with you about investment in human potential." For the next hour, Carmen presented case studies, statistics, and testimonies from women whose lives had been transformed through the program. She spoke about increased family incomes, children who could now afford to attend school, small businesses that were contributing to local economies. The question, she concluded, isn't whether women should be allowed to support themselves. Women have always worked. The question is whether we'll continue limiting them to work that keeps them dependent and economically vulnerable, or whether we'll help them develop skills that allow them to contribute more fully to their communities. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, then someone in the back of the crowd began to applaud. The applause spread until most of the courtyard was filled with the sound. But not everyone was applauding. A man in an expensive black suit stepped forward, and Carmen recognized him as Don Eduardo Vega, the same man her father had tried to force her to marry. The confrontation that followed was a decisive moment, not just for Carmen personally, but for the entire movement she had been building. When Don Eduardo tried to question her about destroying the foundations of Mexican society, Carmen responded with the clarity and conviction of someone who had completely found her voice. The crowd not only supported her, they defended her from their own experience. And when Don Eduardo finally withdrew, Carmen knew something fundamental had changed. She was no longer defending her right to exist as an independent woman. She was advocating for a vision of society that others were ready to embrace. The following years saw extraordinary expansion of Carmen's work. The Protective Society of Destitute Women grew to become a national network with refugees and training centers in 12 cities. The model Carmen had developed adapted to different regions, different needs, different communities, but always maintaining fundamental principles: respect for women's autonomy, practical education leading to real economic independence and community support that made individual change sustainable. Carmen traveled throughout the country, establishing new centers, training local administrators, developing systems that could be replicated. Her work attracted international attention, and she began receiving invitations to speak at conferences in other countries about women's rights and social development. But it was a letter from Maria Elena, now a 17-year-old who had become a teacher, that made her stop and reconsider the direction of her life. Dear Teacher Carmen, the letter said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you taught us, not just to read and write, but to believe we could choose our own destinies. Now I want to teach that same lesson to other children, but I also want to ask you something. Have you ever considered returning to where it all began?" The question touched something deep in Carmen's heart. For years, she had been building a national mission, but suddenly she realized there was a part of herself that yearned to return to the mountains where she had first learned what it meant to be free. In December 1887, Carmen and Francisco boarded the train that would take them back to Tierra Blanca. Carmen carried with her 3 suitcases of clothes, a box of books, and a heart full of nervous expectations about what they would find in the place. That had been her first real refuge. When the train stopped at the familiar wooden platform, Carmen saw a group of people waiting. Not just Maria Elena and the other young women she had mentioned in her letter, but entire families, former students, who were now adults, women who had spent time at the original refuge and had returned for the occasion. What they found in the mountains exceeded all their expectations. The refuge had not only survived, but had prospered and grown. There were now 2 new buildings, one clearly designed as a classroom, another that appeared to be a library or community center. The gardens had grown to become a true small farm, creating an oasis of abundance in the mountainous landscape. "Who has been taking care of all this?" Carmen asked, amazed. "All of us," replied Esperanza, who had remained in Tierra Blanca as refuge administrator after Carmen departed. "Every woman who passed through here contributes something before leaving. Some with work, others with money, others with skills. The place grew by itself." During a community dinner that night, Carmen heard stories that filled her with silent wonder. The refuge had harbored more than 40 women during the 3 years of her absence. 3 of them had established successful businesses in nearby towns. 2 had become certified midwives. 1 had learned enough carpentry to build houses. Another had developed a new technique for preserving food that was now used throughout the region. Maria Elena had organized a group of young women who wanted to become teachers to work in rural communities. Her vision was to create not just a school, but a pedagogical institute that could train teachers to work in rural communities throughout Mexico. Carmen realized she had returned not to resume the work she had left, but to begin something completely new. With Maria Elena and the other young women, she developed a plan to establish the Tierra Blanca Pedagogical Institute, a training center that would combine formal education with practical training, creating a model that could be replicated in other mountainous regions. One spring morning in 1888, Carmen sat at the kitchen table where she had written her first free words years ago. She opened her notebook to a blank page and wrote, "Today, I understood the difference between ending a story and completing a circle. For years, I thought my story had ended when I escaped from my father, or when I married Francisco, or when we established the refuge, or when I went to Mexico City. But today I realized that all of those were just chapters in a story that isn't about my escape, but about my return. Not return to the place I was before, but return to the place that became what it could be, because someone had the courage to believe change was possible. The nameless woman who arrived here no longer exists. In her place is Carmen Herrera, teacher, organizer, wife-builder of futures that didn't exist before. But more importantly, there's a community of people who learned they can choose how to live, how to work, how to love each other. The circle is complete. I escaped to find freedom, found freedom to create more freedom, created enough freedom to return home not as a fugitive, but as a founder. Tomorrow, the work will begin of training a new generation of teachers who will take these lessons to places they haven't yet reached. The circle will expand again, but this time from roots so deep that no storm can uproot them. Carmen closed the notebook and looked out the window toward the mountains that rose against the starlit sky. Somewhere beyond those mountains were women who still didn't know they had options, girls who hadn't yet learned they could choose their own destinies, communities that hadn't yet discovered what was possible when all their members had the opportunity to develop their full potential. But she also knew there were seeds planted, systems established, people trained who would continue the work of expansion and transformation. Her role had evolved again, from builder to sustainer, from pioneer to mentor, from refugee to founder of refugees. Francisco found her writing and sat beside her at the table he had built with his own hands years ago. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Carmen smiled, feeling a peace so deep it seemed to emanate from her bones. "I'm thinking I finally understand what it means to be home," she said. "It's not a place where you're born or where you stay. It's a place you build with the people you love, for the people you love, including the people you don't yet know, but who will someday need what you've learned to offer." Outside, the night wind whispered among the pines, with the same voice she had heard the first night she had slept safely in this house. But now she understood that the wind wasn't just the sound of solitude. It was the sound of possibilities, traveling among the mountains, carrying seeds of change to places where they could take root and flourish. The nameless woman had finally found not just her name, but her place in the world. And that place was exactly where she had begun, in a house in the mountains, where love had taught that freedom was possible, and where freedom had taught that true love multiplies when it's shared. This is a story about the transformative power of choice, about how one woman can change not just her own life, but create waves of change that touch countless other lives. Carmen began as a desperate fugitive and became a founder of futures, demonstrating that true freedom isn't just about escaping oppression, but about using that freedom to create more freedom in the world. Her journey from the mountains of Tierra Blanca to Mexico City and back to the mountains represents the complete circle of personal and social transformation. And her legacy, the Pedagogical Institute, the national network of refugees, the hundreds of women whose lives were touched by her example, continues growing long after her personal story finds its resolution. Because the best stories of liberation don't end with one person's freedom. They end with the creation of systems and cultures that make freedom possible for many other people who will come after.